Today's lecture is on Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia. We skipped a sort of a half lecture. It could have turned into a whole day lecture on Ivan the Terrible. And I will tell you about that in short order. My whole thesis this year about Russia is that Russia is different. Russia is always a little bit more Asiatic than the other European states. And so once again, we're talking about Peter the Great. Peter the Great is our example of part of the royal state or royal absolutism that is happening at the same time, more or less, that Louis XIV is doing his thing, or at the same period of time when the Prussians are starting to try absolutism, the Austrians are trying it, and so on as well. Well, here's kind of the first lecture on Russia that I didn't do for you is Russia a European country? Or to what extent is Russia a European country? It's both Europe, for sure, it's there, but it's also Asia. The land mass goes all the way across Asia and ends at the Pacific. That makes it an Asiatic country as well. But there's something more that makes it a sort of semi-Asiatic country that I'll tell you about in just a second. And as I said, it's just always a little bit different, always a little bit behind the rest. And it seems like, and hopefully I could prove this, but it seems like it's a bit more brutal, a bit more authoritarian than some of the Western European states. So one of the reasons that it is kind of more culturally or politically authoritarian and brutal, perhaps, is that for a period of a couple hundred years, it was dominated by the Mongols. The Mongols come out of what is more or less today Mongolia, take over much of Asia, take over much of the Middle East, and make all their way up to Moscow and take over Moscow or raid Moscow and put the Russians under their control. So from about 1251 to 1480, the period of time when the Russians are starting to move into, kind of like our class period time, modern European history. Right before that, they're dominated by these people who have a completely different understanding of the nature of power and what the leader should be. They have this sort of Asiatic culture that they are adopting through cultural diffusion. They learn that women should be sort of kept apart from men or sort of haremized in a way, and that the ruler, whoever the ruler might be, has absolute power over everything, life and death, that social hierarchy is fixed and extreme. And they get all of these cultural beliefs from the Mongols. Now, the Mongols don't actually take them over and rule over them on a day-to-day basis. They kind of raid them, smash things, kill a bunch of people, and then say, you will bring us tribute every year. And if you don't bring us tribute every year, we'll be back and we'll do the same thing all over again. And so it's actually the upper classes or the princes of Moscow who collect tribute or collect taxes for those Mongols and bring it down to them. And then the Mongols force these Russian princes to kind of fall on their bellies and crawl towards them, never looking at them as they bring all of this tribute. And the Russian princes, when they're done humiliating themselves in this way, crawling away with never looking at the Mongol Khan, when they get out of earshot of them, they say, wow, that was awesome. Someday we should be like that. We should have that kind of power. The same thing is true then as they come in contact with the Byzantine Empire. Oh, that was a perfect segue for Mr. Sigmund. He's talking about the Byzantine Empire today. The Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, is where the Russians get their version of Christianity from. It is the Orthodox faith. Where does the rest of, more or less the rest of Europe get their Christianity from? Where's the Pope live? Rome, yeah, it's the Roman Catholic Church, right? So two competing versions of Christianity. For the most part, we talk about Catholicism and all the branches off from that. But these guys are part of this Eastern Roman tradition, the Orthodox tradition. In the Eastern tradition, they have, for a much longer period of time, a Caesar. They have an emperor. And that emperor is believed to be holier or believed to be godlike as well. And so when the Russians take over their notion of having a czar, by the way, czar is the exact same word as Caesar, Kaiser, they want to have the same kinds of powers, sort of godlike powers. And people over time believe that the czar is a kind of little god on earth. So they get their idea about power from the Byzantines. They get their Orthodox faith from the Byzantines. So it's going to be a little bit different. Because of that, because of their cultural connection, because of their Asiatic location, we don't have the things that we've already talked about for this class happening in Russia. There's no Eastern Renaissance. There's no Renaissance there at all. There are no New World explorations. There is no Reformation happening. There is no war of religion that happens there. So a very different kind of thing. But now we start to see that they get a little bit more like what you have going on in Western Europe. There is a new monarch, and his name is Ivan Grozny, or Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible is in the 16th century, so he's kind of around the time of Henry VIII, for example, a new monarch. A bit later, maybe, a slightly different generation. In fact, we didn't talk about Elizabeth, who is Henry VIII's daughter, but apparently Ivan proposed marriage to Elizabeth, which is one of the more bizarre things that ever happened. It would have been really bizarre and wonderful had they gotten married. Ivan the Terrible is a new monarch. He does number one. He controls the nobles, oftentimes by just killing them, sometimes with his own hands. He gets revenue from a very difficult source, which is this Russian economy, which is kind of backwards. He has law and administration. He controls the church as being czar, with that Orthodox connection. He's kind of considered to be godlike. And then he's able to take over some territory as well. He's also pretty crazy. He goes insane and believes that his political enemies are plotting against him, and so he oftentimes just sort of randomly kills people, or goes to a town and randomly kills everyone in the town. He's very paranoid. He reminds Russians, I think, of a later Russian leader who kind of does similar things to a whole lot of people, named Stalin. So Russia starts out as a very Asiatic place. They've got that Asiatic connection with the Mongols. They've got that different cultural connection with the Byzantine Empire. And now we get to the person that we're talking about today, Peter the Great. Now, Peter is a young man who has a brother who is, let's say, developmentally disabled. They're both supposed to rule together, but in reality, neither one of them rule. When they're young, their sister is in charge. Peter spends his youth then playing war games with other noble children, with real guns, real gunpowder, real weapons. Sometimes people die in these war games that they're playing, but he's learning how to command troops, and he and his friends at some point in time decide to overthrow his sister, and he becomes czar. Just pushes his brother out of the way. Peter grew up in Moscow, and the Russians were really quite afraid of foreigners and foreign influence. So they had this place, what they called the German Quarter. It was the place where foreigners were sort of kept apart from the rest of the Russians. Peter liked to hang out in the German Quarter and learn things from some of those foreigners there. He apparently had a really good friendship with a Dutch guy and learned how to build ships and learned how to sail ships as well. He falls in love with the idea of Russia having a navy. The rest of the Russians are not crazy about that. When Peter finally becomes old enough to rule and overthrown his sister, he decides to do something that no Russian leader had ever done before. He decides to leave Russia. And he goes on this, what they call the Great Embassy to Europe. So for about a year and a half, He and an entourage of a couple hundred high-ranking Russians wander through the Holy Roman Empire. They go to the Netherlands. They go to England. They're hanging out in England for a bit. They hear that a palace revolt is going on, and they have to, as quickly as possible, go back to Russia. On his travels, Peter increased his love for foreign things, for European things. And he decided that after his great embassy, he would change Russia fundamentally. He would make it more of a European power so that it could compete with other European powers. And so when he comes back to Moscow, first thing he does is snuff out that revolt. Once again, personally killing a bunch of people, beheading a bunch of his palace guard who had revolted in his absence. And then he says, okay, everyone, we're going to become European. And by everyone, I mean the nobles and the people who matter. Everybody else doesn't really. He demands that they start wearing Western-style clothing. So bye-bye furs and hello, short croppy pants and silk stockings and shoes and not sort of Asiatic-looking fur clothing. He tells the men around him, all of the noble men, that it's time for them to start shaving. And in Western Europe, everybody's shaving, they clean-shaven faces, and they need to shave their big, bushy Russian beards. A lot of them don't want to do that. They view their beard as kind of a manly symbol. And so when they show up the next day to court, some of them hadn't shaved. Peter knocks them down, puts his knees on their chest, and pulls their beards out with his hands. He's a very strong person. They realize then that he's very serious, and everybody goes home and shaves. He also produced an etiquette book to tell them about Western European manners. Western Europeans who go to Moscow around this period of time or before this period of time are horrified that the Russians know nothing about manners. Why don't they know anything about, Renaissance manners? Which book did they not get? Castiglione's The Courtier is just not available. And so he's creating his own version of that, really. And they start to read it and they say, okay, this is what we're gonna start doing. We're not gonna vomit on each other, after drinking huge amounts of vodka. That's wrong. We shouldn't do that. So an etiquette book is produced, and everybody who's anybody has to read it. He demands that noble children be educated, noble boys be educated. He wants them to be able to serve him in his law administration. He also just gets rid of some of the letters in the Russian alphabet. If you're that powerful, you can do that. He also requires that men and women start mingling. They socialize together like they do in Western Europe. And he even told the people living in the German quarter that they could leave the German quarter and start mingling with and living among the Russians in Moscow. He wants Russians to become more Western European. And once again, the reason for this is not just because he loves Western European things, but he wants to have a powerful state. And he knows that the most powerful states are the ones like Louis XIV's France. That's a nice image of Peter snipping the beard of one of his boyars of a noble. Really, the size is all out of whack. It's all out of proportion. You know why there is no perspective? You know Renaissance, right? No Renaissance art. Really, Peter's like 6.5 feet tall. He's much taller than most normal people. And as I said, extremely strong. Well, number one is getting control, and it's getting control of the nobles for the most part. If we're talking about the royal state, or if we're talking about the monarchy. Once again, he comes back after this revolt, and it was a revolt of the palace guard that made him come back quickly. And then, as I said, he was executing some of these people from the palace guard himself. That takes away this group of armed people who were close to him, who could have been a threat to him. Another thing that he's doing is that westernization. If he is forcing people who are around him to dress like him, to learn these etiquette rules, to become educated like him, to appreciate Western European culture, in a sense, isn't he kind of doing something similar to what Louis XIV is doing where you bring everybody to Versailles and you teach them the etiquette of Versailles and so on. He's controlling them in a very personal way. I got this great story too. I got to tell you this anecdote. He goes to the Netherlands on his trip, on his great embassy, and the Dutch are kind of into science at this point in time, and the Dutch are trying to figure out how the human body works. So he goes to an autopsy or an anatomy lesson where a human body is being cut open, and he's there with some of his royal retinue, and he's just fascinated. He's looking, they're cutting open the skin and flaying it out, and cutting open the guts and looking at everything. And he turns and he looks, and all of the guys that he's with are sort of horrified that this is going on. They don't want to look at the human body in this way. And so he orders them to come to the table and bite through the tendons of this corpse, which they do. But once again, there's sort of a cool twofold reason that he does this. One is he doesn't want them to be afraid of Western things and newfangled thinking and science and so on. And the other one is he just wants to have a whole lot of power. And if you can get somebody to bite through tendons, I think that you probably have some pretty good power. I'll show you how he does 1 through 6 really quickly. Number 1 is creating a new capital. Out of a swamp, he creates a place called St. Petersburg. And remember how Louis XIV created Versailles? It's bigger than that, right? You create an entire city named after himself. It's pretty good. This new capital is, as I say, just created on swampland that he took from the Swedes in one of these long wars from the Swedes that he has. And he forces the nobles to move there from Moscow and to build stone houses and to live there. It's a little bit different once again. It's not fun like in Louis XIV's Versailles. It's not entertaining. It's just a completely new place. That is, if you know where St. Petersburg is, it's on the Baltic Sea. It makes it really easy by ship to get to all the rest of Europe. Moscow is several hundred miles inland from that. It's really difficult. Not too many Europeans are going to go to Moscow, and it's really difficult to get from Moscow to other places. So it's a window on the west. And he relocates all the government offices from Moscow to St. Petersburg. And for Europeans, it's kind of a symbol, and for Russians too, it's a symbol that they are interested in being a Western European country like the rest of them. Just as an aside, about 30 to 40,000 people, well, not really people, just serfs, died building this thing. So he orders that tens of thousands of serfs go to this swamp and create a city out of it, and they just die. But it gets done. Another way that he is creating or controlling the nobles, number 1, is to create new nobles. On his trip to Western Europe, he was hiring people left and right. Dutch people, English people, German people, it doesn't really matter. He's hiring them to go back to Russia and show the Russians how to do whatever it is that they do well. So it might be somebody who is an experienced military officer. It might be somebody who knows how to do mining. It might be somebody who knows how to do shipbuilding. He's hiring these people. He gives them Russian titles. He makes them nobles. When you create new nobles, especially if they're foreigners, they're going to be very loyal to him. They're not going to plot against him with Russians. He also forces the Russian nobles to serve him. If you are a noble, you must work for Peter. You can do that either as a military figure in the army, or you can do that as a desk jockey in the bureaucracy that he creates. Towards the end of his life, he didn't know it was the end of his life, but towards the end of his life, he also created a completely new table of ranks. One was military, one was government service, and then one was just straight up nobility. And what he did was put everyone, no matter if they were a prince or a duke or a baron or whatever, put everyone at rank 1, and then allowed them to rise in the ranks only to how well they served him. So previously, if you've been born a prince, you're a prince, and that's that. Or if you're a duke, and that's that. But now he's putting everybody at an even playing field and saying, you want to rise in the social hierarchy? Serve me well, and you'll do that. It doesn't last too long because, as I say, he dies a few years later. But it's a great idea. That makes then your social rank in the nobility not based on your birth, not on lineage, but just on how well you serve. And finally, he has a wife, very traditional Russian woman who can't stand him because of all of his newfangled ideas, and he divorces her, sends her off to a convent, and he's done with her. Randomly, as he's on a military campaign, he sees a Lithuanian woman who was serving one of his generals, and he decides that this Lithuanian woman might make a good partner for him, and so he says to his general, "Can I have her?" And the general says, "Of course, Your Majesty, you can." Well, he ends up marrying her and making her his empress. That just doesn't happen. Disney will tell you that happens, but it just never does. People of the same rank married each other, and so by choosing whatever that Lithuanian woman had that made her the perfect match for him, by choosing a commoner and a foreigner to be his empress, he was just once again showing how he doesn't care about Russian tradition. He wants to do something completely different. And he gets to decide who's at the top of society based on how well they serve him. In terms of the economy, this would be like number 2, trying to get revenue, I think. He makes some changes economically speaking. He tries the mercantilism that I described to you with Jean-Baptiste Colbert, trying to export things and not import things, trying to collect gold and silver in the treasury, trying to improve the economy, but for the state's sake and not for individuals' sake, for a capitalist kind of thing. He puts taxes on everything. Russia does not have a strong economy, darn near forever. Well, I'm going to say forever if we look at their economy even today. And so he puts taxes on everything because he's trying to squeeze as much wealth as he can out of this place. He puts taxes on things like, well, the funniest one is there's a beard tax for non-nobles. If you want to wear a beard, you have to pay a tax. And then they give you this little coin that you can wear around your neck. It's got a hole in it, and it's got a picture of a beard on it. So if the taxman is walking past you and he sees you have a beard, he'll say, show me that you paid the beard tax. And you move your beard aside and show him a little coin with the beard on it. Okay, you can go on. Puts taxes on coffins, puts taxes on houses, ends up putting taxes on people's heads because everybody had one. So just trying to squeeze as much wealth as possible from a place that really doesn't have it. As I said, he hires Western experts to run industry, I guess is what you would call it even way back then. He turns over the serfs that he owns to people who have great ideas for the economy. Like if somebody says, Your Majesty, I'm going to have a mine in the Ural Mountains. I'm going to try to get some iron ore out of the Ural Mountains. Like, how many serfs would you like? How about 3,000? Yes, Your Majesty, I'd really enjoy it. Then I have to pay the serfs. They're pretty much the same as slaves. So that works out well, I guess, for some people. It doesn't work out so well for the serfs. Even with all of these attempts to have a great economy, the gap between the Western European states, which are doing better and or faster and creating more, the Russians are sort of still falling behind. In terms of governmental administration, this would be number 3, law and administration. They steal Sweden's example of having a bureaucracy. The Swedes have this thing called colleges. It has nothing to do with academia or education or anything. It's just what they call a governmental a governmental department that takes care of something. So there's like 6 to 8 of them. There might be a college for war, and there might be a college for the economy, and there might be a college for, westernization or something like that. He puts 3 different people in charge of each one of these governmental departments. One is a Russian noble. That's probably what was expected for the government in Russia at that period of time. But then he would also hire a non-noble Russian, and then he would also hire a Western expert or foreigner. And the three people together are supposed to run this, college of war or college of the economy. Can you imagine that worked out actually pretty well if you don't really trust your nobility, or if you don't trust a bourgeois person who's running your bureaucracy, or if you don't trust a foreigner? Those three people working together can kind of tattle on each other or be afraid together that Peter will do something to them if things don't go particularly well. So it's a system that kind of works out. It's dividing and conquering and not allowing anybody to stand up against it. In terms of controlling the church, Peter probably could have done this better had he not been so different. Churches are usually conservative. Would you agree? They don't really like to change very much from traditional beliefs. And so you can imagine that Peter the Great, as somebody who's embracing Western European ideas, for the church or churchmen is embracing things that seem really kind of foreign and not orthodox, the Orthodox Christian church. And so when the quote unquote Pope of the Russian church, a guy that they call the Patriarch, when he passed away, he replaced him not with another patriarch, but with a kind of council or a synod of 10 bishops. So in a sense, imagine if Louis XIV had been able to get rid of the Pope and replace the Pope with a council of 10 cardinals. It's really, once again, kind of a powerful thing he's able to do. And then he goes beyond that and he puts his own guy in to sort of control that Holy Synod. So his procurator or his own bureaucrat is sitting in on this council of bishops and telling them what Peter wants from them. And they generally are very pliable. If you have one figure, like a patriarch or a pope, that person can sometimes stand up to you, right? This happens to Henry VIII. Breaking down the one person to the 10 is just a wonderful way of controlling the church. There's this small group of people in Russia too who are a religious minority. They're called Old Believers, and Peter doesn't really care too much about them. The church hates them and wants to do away with them. Peter doesn't care that much. He just doesn't. So there's maybe a little bit less persecution of the Old Believers under Peter. He doesn't see what this one is. Peter's military reforms are really quite substantial when you consider where the Russians had been before Peter comes into power. Once again, they had this group of guys with a palace guard called the Streltsy. Have you ever seen the movie The Wizard of Oz? You know, the Wicked Witch with the flying monkeys? She has these guys who kind of all march around together in fur and pikes. That's kind of what the Streltsy were like. Peter does away with them and creates a modern military, just like what everybody in Western Europe is doing. So uniforms, uniform weapons, foreign experts running things. He completely revolutionizes the Russian military, making it capable of taking on a Western European state. He expands it too by conscription or drafting to 300,000 troops, which is just 100,000 shy of Louis XIV's 400,000 at the height of his reign. He also starts to create, for the first time ever, a Russian navy. Once again, he was sort of obsessed with navies and ships and sailing. Starts this off in the 1690s, but once he takes over part of the Baltic, he's able to create a Baltic fleet. And then his Baltic fleet is able to defeat the Swedish fleet that controls the Baltic in the early 1700s. So he's created this modern military that looks like everybody else's military. By leaps and bounds, he's getting Russia to become just like everybody else. He has a war against the Ottoman Empire, which is kind of where he is trying out some things, trying out the new military he does okay against the Ottoman Empire. Later, you'll see throughout European history, Russia beats up on the Ottoman Empire pretty easily. And so showing you that he's not able to completely dominate them at the beginning of his reign shows you how backward his forces were at the beginning. And then he gets involved in this really long war called the Great Northern War, about 20-some years of war with Sweden. Sweden is at this point in time, you might remember when we were looking at the size of armies and the number of people in the army and so on. Sweden is a small country with an oversized military, and a lot of different states wanted to take Sweden down, and so this is part of that Great Northern War. First time that there's a big battle, the Russians get whipped. They have 40,000 troops against 8,000 Swedes. And the 8,000 Swedes attack, and the 40,000 Russians scatter. Peter learns from that, westernizes military, and goes to battle again with the Swedes, and this time whips the Swedes, and is able to get some of that Baltic coastline and then create St. Petersburg out of that. He's able to grab some territory as well. Let's look at this map, so you can see anything here. You can see the Ottoman Empire down towards the south. You can see that the Black Sea is really kind of an Ottoman sea or an Ottoman lake at this point in time. Peter is able to grab a little bit of territory right here. Later on, of course, the Russians will be able to pick up the Crimea, that thing that's hanging out in the Black Sea. And here's Sweden is up here. Sweden and Finland are together at this point in time. And he's able to grab this territory on the coast of the Baltic Sea, and St. Petersburg is as well. You can see how quick it would be to get to the rest of Europe. And you can also see how huge this landmass is, or this territory is, from Poland all the way to the Pacific. That's about 12 time zones. So the length of this state is just enormous. And he's able to take over Kamchatka, those who play Risk know about that. And then he's able to get this little bit here over by St. Petersburg. That's pretty much all he grabs. He's not the one who's taking over all of this vast territory. But this is obviously, or the Baltic, extremely important. Sad story to end today. Peter had a son, he had an heir, Alexei, and Alexei was the son of his first wife. And so when mom got sent away to a convent, his son, Alexei, was not too happy about that. And Alexei grew up sympathizing with mom and not liking dad very much. Alexei started to talk about how when his dad died, he was going to change everything back to the way it was before his dad. Peter thought that was a horrible idea. It drove him kind of nuts. But let's face it, kids and their parents oftentimes get in these sorts of weird fights. And sometimes your kid turns out to be the opposite. Well, Alexei married, and at one point in time, he fled Russia. He goes to Western Europe, and he's hiding out in Western Europe. Peter is livid that his son has escaped, and puts out feelers to find out where his son is, finds out that he's hiding in the Holy Roman Empire, demands the Holy Roman Emperor return his son. That happens. Peter wants to know if Alexei was involved in a plot to overthrow him, and they start to question him, and the questioning involves torture. The torture gets out of hand, and Alexei dies. So essentially he kills his own heir. He also then gets sick and doesn't name a successor, and passes away without naming a successor. So his wife takes over for a little bit, and then a whole series of people who are sort of kind of related to Peter take over for a number of years. There's a hodgepodge of weak rulers after Peter. And things don't go great until finally his daughter takes over 10 years later. But even though Russia falls from greatness after Peter, it becomes much of a less incredible and powerful state. Peter really does put it on track to be what it is, a European power, and then eventually a kingdom. What questions do you have for me?